Inside of this selector, I'm going to add some new properties and values that we haven't seen yet. I'll type them out, and I want you to follow along. After we've typed them and seen the result, I'll explain what they mean. So I'm going to type max-width and give it a value of 940 pixels, or px. And then I'm going to type margin, followed by a 0, and then a space, and the word auto, just like that. Now, let's save, and I'd like you to guess as to what this might do right before we refresh the page here. So let's refresh, and as you can see, it looks like it centered a lot of the stuff on our page here. So everything that was inside of that div is now centered, but it has not affected things that were outside of the div. Now let's investigate the code. The first property, called max width, is closely related to the simpler and more common property width. So we could have just said width and then given it a value, but instead we went with max width. We're basically saying that we want the width to be no larger than 940 pixels across. However, the width could potentially be smaller than that if the browser were less than 400 pixels wide. This will come in handy when we make more styling adjustments for mobile and desktop devices. The next declaration sets the margin for the wrapper, or the spacing around the element. This is shorthand that will set the margin on all four sides by using just two values. The first value sets the margin on the top and the bottom of the element, which in this case is just set to 0. The unit doesn't matter in this case, because if we were to set it to a pixel value, like this, or another unit, such as a percentage value, it would still mean the same thing. So we can go ahead and just leave it at 0 without declaring a unit. The second value, auto, will simply fill in any space that's on the left or right side of the margin. In other words, if we were to take the entire width of the page and then subtract 940 pixels in the middle, the rest of the space on the left and right is automatically filled in with whatever's left over. We don't need to worry about it. I want you to be able to see what's physically happening on the page. So let's go ahead and color the background orange. And I've used another shorthand property here. Instead of saying background color, I've just said background. There are more properties that we can add to background, and we'll get into that later. But for now, let's just save this and see what this does to the page. So if I refresh the page, you can see that this div is now colored orange. And if we scroll down, you can see a little bit more of what this looks like. If I resize the browser, you'll see that it adds a scroll bar to the bottom of the page. But if I move the scroll bar just slightly, you'll see that it's only adding that because the images are too large, when in fact, the div that we added, the wrapper, fits perfectly inside of the browser window here. So if the images were smaller, we wouldn't get this scroll bar. But what that means is that this element, this wrapper, is flexing with the browser window. It has a maximum width of 940 pixels, but it can get infinitely smaller than that. One problem here is that our text runs right up against the edge of the element, and therefore will be right against the edge of the browser window at smaller sizes. We need to add some spacing around the inside of the element called padding in order to fix this. So let's go ahead and add some padding right after our margin here. So I'll say padding 0, and then the second value will be 5%. Similar to margin, we've used two values here. The first value represents the top and bottom, so there's 0 padding on the top and bottom. The second value represents the left and right. In our case, we're applying 5% padding to both sides of the element. This will be 5% of the total width of the wrapper element itself. Let's go ahead and save this and then refresh the preview to see what this did for us. As you can see, we now have some spacing on the inside of our element, as well as some spacing on the outside of our element. If I go ahead and resize the browser, you'll notice that the padding is changing ever so slightly because it's only 5%, but it's still definitely changing and adjusting to the width of the browser. This will be important later on because not all browser windows are the same size. For example, on a mobile device, the browser window will be much smaller than what it looks like on our desktop device here.